March 2nd, 1942. The dawn broke red over the Sittang River plain in Burma, a colour Arthur Kellam would later say looked less like sunrise and more like a warning. Private Kellam of the East Surrey Regiment, 23 years old, tall but underfed, with a stubbornness so deep it bordered on madness, crouched behind a collapsed earthen embankment while the world around him fell apart. Shells were landing in ragged arcs. Lewis gun casings were scattered everywhere. Men were shouting, but the words dissolved in the chaos. Moments earlier, the order to fall back had been issued, but the ground behind them was a maze of mud, burning debris, and retreating columns. The Japanese advance had erupted so violently that entire platoons were simply swallowed by jungle. Arthur's fingers trembled as he jammed a fresh magazine into his weapon, if 3 rounds counted as fresh. Across the road, he saw Corporal Haynes dragging a wounded man by the collar. Farther down the line, 2 gunners were firing blindly, smoke pouring from overheated barrels. Someone screamed for medics. Someone else shouted that the Japanese were flanking. Arthur didn't believe anything except the sound of his own breathing and the faint metallic click of his rifle bolt. Through the haze, he finally saw them, Japanese infantry emerging in disciplined lines from the tree line, their helmets glinting faintly in the smoky light. Arthur fired. The recoil smacked into his shoulder. He fired again. He felt a strange calm, the kind that only happens when terror has exhausted itself. His section commander was yelling at him to pull back, but Arthur kept shooting because the men nearest him were frozen and because the idea of running felt like surrender, and because in that collapsing battlefield he could only think of holding 1 more minute, 10 more seconds, any scrap of time that would slow the inevitable. When the grenade exploded near him, he didn't hear the sound. He saw the ground tilt sideways, saw sky where dirt should be, saw a blur of red. Then he saw nothing. He awoke with his face pressed into damp soil, wrists tied, flies buzzing around his ears. A Japanese soldier nudged him with a boot, muttering to another guard. Arthur was pulled upright and shoved into a line of captured survivors. Some men were limping, others were bleeding freely. A few stared with hollow eyes, as if they had already retreated inside their skulls. The march began. For 3 days, they trudged through heat so thick it felt like the jungle was trying to swallow their breath. Guards struck anyone who slowed. Twice, Arthur watched men collapse. Twice the guards ended their suffering with a shot. By the second night, Arthur felt his legs trembling uncontrollably. When he nearly fell, a guard raised his rifle butt. Arthur steadied himself, barely. The guard lowered the weapon with an annoyed grunt, as if disappointed not to have an excuse. At the temporary holding site near POW, the prisoners were herded into bamboo pens. Arthur was shoved into a corner, the air stinking of sweat and rot. That first night, he listened to a man whisper the Lord's Prayer, voice cracking. Somewhere outside, guards dragged screaming wounded toward a hut that smelled of disinfectant but offered no healing. By morning, those men were gone. During those early days of captivity, Arthur discovered patterns. Guards respected silence. They despised hesitation. They tolerated endurance but not compassion. The first time he helped another prisoner stand, he received a blow across his cheek that split the skin. When he instinctively shielded the other man, 2 more blows followed. But Arthur didn't stop. He learned quickly that the Japanese didn't understand why a starving man would give strength to another. They saw it as defiance. One evening, a guard with a scarred jaw approached Arthur and asked, through a translator, why he had continued firing after the retreat order. Arthur answered honestly, "Because the men near me needed time." The guard stared at him, lips pressed thin, then walked away. Arthur didn't know it then, but that moment marked him in their minds. Not as a troublemaker, not as a threat, but as a problem to be broken. After 2 weeks, the prisoners were packed into wooden rail wagons. The journey north to Thanbyuzayat was a nightmare of heat, thirst, and desperation. 40 men crammed in, then 60, then more. The doors slammed shut. The train lurched forward. Within minutes, the air curdled into a suffocating stew of sweat and excrement. Men fainted. Some vomited. The floor became slick with filth. On the second day, the guards tossed in a bucket of water so violently that half of it spilled instantly. Arthur forced his way through the chaos, not to drink first, but to pull a delirious soldier, Thomas Reeve, away from being trampled. Arthur cupped a handful of water to Thomas's mouth. A guard saw. The guard stared with cold irritation, memorizing the act. Arthur knew the look. This man would wait for his moment. When the prisoners arrived at their destination, the base camp for the construction of what would become the Burma-Thailand Railway, Arthur saw living conditions he didn't think possible outside hell. Mud everywhere. Emaciated men hauling logs thicker than their chests. Bodies carried each morning to pyres burning at the edge of the clearing. A medical tent with no medicine. A latrine trench swarming with flies so thick it looked alive. And the work began. 12-hour days became 14. Food was watery rice laced with pebbles. Water often tasted of rust. Malaria, cholera, beriberi. Diseases spread faster than guards could punish them. Men aged 10 years in 2 months. Arthur developed a rhythm. Swing the hammer, breathe, swing again. Splinters tore open the flesh of his palms. His back spasmed constantly. Sometimes he hallucinated sounds of home. His mother calling him inside for supper. His brother singing off-key in the back garden. But reality always returned. The shouts of guards, the slap of bamboo canes, the laboured groans of exhausted prisoners. One day in late April, Arthur witnessed a man collapse under the weight of a timber beam. Before the guard reached him to deliver punishment, Arthur stepped forward and lifted the beam onto his own shoulder. The guard barked something angrily. Arthur didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. The guard didn't want Arthur to help. He wanted an excuse to beat the failing man. Arthur refused to give him one. The guard struck Arthur instead, twice, maybe 3 times. But Arthur didn't drop the beam. Men around him whispered in disbelief. Later that night, one of them said quietly, "You're either the bravest man alive or the stupidest." Arthur didn't answer. He didn't think of it as brave. His mind worked in simple arithmetic. One man couldn't carry the beam. He could. That was enough. By the 80th day of captivity, Arthur's ribs jutted sharply beneath his skin. His legs shook when he stood from the ground. Yet he refused to slow his pace. Guards began assigning him to the hardest tasks, not because he volunteered, but because he endured. They wanted to find his breaking point. On the 120th day, during monsoon season, Arthur waded through waist-deep mud, carrying a basket of rocks. Rain poured so hard, it felt like the sky was collapsing. Men slipped, fell, and vanished momentarily beneath the sludge. Arthur heard a shout, someone sinking too fast. Without thinking, he dropped his load, slogged through the muck, and grabbed the drowning man by the arm. A guard sprinted toward them, with a bamboo cane raised high. Arthur braced for the blow. It came, cracking across his shoulder. Then another. Then a third. He shielded the drowning man with his own body until others pulled him free. When Arthur stood upright again, blood streamed down his back. The guard stared at him with a mixture of anger and something like fear. Arthur didn't understand it then, but the guard had encountered something he could not control, a man willing to take pain without hesitation. Disease tore through the camp in cycles. First malaria, then dysentery, then cholera. Arthur saw men die so quickly their bodies were still warm when carried away. One night, a fevered Australian began screaming that snakes were crawling across his chest. Arthur held him down, whispering that it was only the fever. The man died by dawn. Arthur didn't cry. He couldn't. Something in him had locked shut. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford. By the 200th day, Arthur's weight had dropped dangerously low. Guards noticed. They began targeting him more aggressively. They forced him to repeat tasks they knew he could barely complete. They withheld water. They placed him in front of the line during inspections, where kneeling too slowly earned a blow. Arthur accepted each punishment quietly, but he refused to kneel lower than the others. He knelt the same, not more. That subtle disobedience infuriated them. On the 229th day, Arthur made a mistake. He stumbled during roll call. Just one step, one slip of the foot. The guard with the scarred jaw, who had marked him from the beginning, struck him across the face. Arthur fell. The guard ordered him to stand. Arthur stood. The guard struck him again. Arthur didn't flinch. The guard hit him a third time, harder, with intent. Arthur tasted blood, but he stood upright, refusing to show weakness. After a long stare, the guard spat on the ground and walked away. Arthur remained in line, barely breathing. Around the 260th day, during a cholera outbreak, Arthur volunteered to carry contaminated bodies to the burning pits. No one else dared, not because they didn't want to help, but because they feared infection. Arthur's hands shook as he lifted limp corpses onto bamboo stretchers, each one a reminder that survival was a fragile, temporary gift. One of the doctors, a gaunt, exhausted man who had seen death more than life, told Arthur quietly, "If you keep this up, the disease will take you." Arthur answered, "If it doesn't, something else will. Might as well choose what kind of man I am before it happens." By the 300th day, no one in the camp doubted that Arthur was different. Some whispered that he was already half dead, running purely on will. Others believed he had accepted that he would never leave and had decided to make every day count for something. Arthur didn't analyze himself. He simply woke each morning with a single thought: one more day. Near the end of the first year, the guards introduced a new punishment: standing at attention under direct sunlight for hours. Arthur was often selected. He'd stand motionless as sweat poured down his face, as flies crawled across his lips, as the ground shimmered with heat. Men fainted. Arthur swayed but refused to fall. Once, after nearly 5 hours, he collapsed. A guard splashed water on him and shoved him back into line. Arthur forced himself upright, vision blurring. The guard looked irritated, as if Arthur's refusal to die was personally inconvenient. On the 365th day, 1 year into captivity, Arthur lay on the bamboo floor listening to rain hammer the roof. A man beside him whispered, "Kellam, you think we'll live through another year?" Arthur answered softly, "We'll live through tomorrow. That's enough to start with." The man wept quietly. Arthur stared at the roof, knowing that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, but he refused to say anything else. By the time the first year closed, Arthur had no idea he still had more than 400 days to go. If he had known, perhaps even he might have faltered, but he didn't know, so he endured. This was only the beginning. By the time Arthur crossed into the second year of captivity, the world outside the jungle might as well have belonged to another lifetime. He no longer marked days with scratches on bamboo. He no longer tried to calculate how long he'd been there. Survival had become something simpler, narrower. Wake, work, endure, sleep, eat when possible, drink whenever allowed, share what little he had with those worse off, and try, through sheer stubbornness, to outlast the cruelty that pressed on them from every direction. The monsoon season deepened. Rain fell in sheets thick enough to hide entire groups of prisoners as they carried logs and rocks and buckets of earth through mud that clung to their legs like wet cement. Arthur's feet were covered in ulcerated sores. His toenails had begun detaching. The pain was constant, but he focused on rhythm. Lift, step, breath evenly, eyes forward. One day in the second week of the new year, Arthur was assigned to a group tasked with clearing a hillside for a new railway cut. The Japanese officer overseeing them, Lieutenant Mori, was notorious for his cruelty. He walked with a riding crop in hand, striking men not because they disobeyed, but because he enjoyed the sound it made. His eyes were always calculating, searching for weakness, like a predator scanning a herd. That morning, Mori barked an order for the men to remove boulders the size of small carts. The tools they were given were inadequate: a few picks, worn hammers, and lengths of bamboo. The sun was relentless. Men strained against rocks that refused to budge, and Mori paced behind them, striking anyone who faltered. When one prisoner, a Welshman named Gareth Hughes, collapsed to his knees, Mori struck him across the back. Gareth tried to stand but couldn't. Mori raised the crop again, and something inside Arthur snapped. He stepped forward, positioned himself between Mori and the fallen prisoner, and bowed low enough to show respect, but not so low as to submit entirely. Mori halted, staring. Arthur kept his head bowed, his voice steady, as he said in halting Japanese, "He will stand soon. He is not refusing." Mori's expression darkened. Silence stretched like a wire pulled tight. Arthur braced for the beating. But instead, Mori walked past him and struck another man at random. It was worse than if he had taken the blow himself. Arthur felt boiling shame. Another man had suffered because he intervened. That night, he told Gareth he was sorry. Gareth, trembling from fever, managed a weak smile and said, "If you hadn't stepped in, I'd be dead. I'll take the bruise." Arthur didn't sleep. The guilt gnawed at him like an animal. The next month brought torment on a scale even Arthur had not imagined possible. Supplies dwindled. Rations shrank. A handful of rice, some days nothing more than a watery broth with leaves and insects floating inside. Men fought off hallucinations. Some whispered to their dead wives. Others believed they saw oasis-like visions in the distance. Arthur himself began hearing voices, his brother's laughter, his father's scolding tone, but he shoved them away, refusing to surrender his grip on reality. One afternoon, after a brutal shift in which 2 prisoners died under falling logs, Arthur returned to the hut to find a man coughing blood. The prisoner, an older civilian engineer from the Dutch East Indies, had cholera. Everyone feared the disease. Some crawled backward on their hands to avoid even brushing against the infected. Arthur knelt at the man's side, cleaned his face, and whispered words of comfort. That night, the man died. Arthur carried the body alone to the pyre. A guard watched, frowning, confused by the act of care. It was as if Arthur's compassion violated some logic the guards believed the world should follow. On the 34th day, Arthur was transferred to a new camp deeper along the railway. The march took 3 days. More than 20 prisoners died along the way. Arthur's group was forced to carry their bodies and leave them on bamboo litters near the jungle edge. The smell of decay hovered over them like a curse. The new camp was worse. The huts were smaller, the food scarcer, and the guards more unpredictable. Mori did not follow them there, but the man who took his place, Sergeant Tomita, was perhaps even more dangerous. Tomita didn't beat prisoners out of anger. He beat them to enforce a ritualistic sense of order. His face never showed emotion, not even satisfaction. It was as if he viewed the prisoners as an extension of the tools they used. If a tool malfunctioned, he struck it. The first encounter Arthur had with Tomita was almost fatal. During a morning inspection, Tomita walked the line, evaluating posture, cleanliness, and uniform condition, things impossible to maintain in such conditions. When he reached Arthur, he stopped. He looked at the frayed hem of Arthur's shorts. He looked at the mud caked around Arthur's ankles. Then he asked, "Why are you dirty?" The translator didn't need to translate. The tone was clear. Arthur answered with the only truth possible. "We worked through the night, sir." Tomita struck him across the jaw with a short baton. Arthur didn't fall. That mattered. Tomita narrowed his eyes. He struck again. Arthur willed himself to remain standing. Tomita stared at him for several seconds, then moved on. But Arthur knew he had been marked again. As days wore on, Arthur's body declined sharply. His cheeks hollowed, his shoulders sharpened into angles. The skin around his ulcers turned black. When he walked, pain shot up his legs like fire, yet he kept moving. If he fell, he knew Tomita would kill him. That simple fact kept him alive as much as anything. On the 480th day, he witnessed an incident no prisoner ever forgot. A young British private, no more than 19, reached into a pot to scrape up remaining grains of rice. A guard caught him. Thanbyuzayat ordered the boy to stand in front of the assembled prisoners. Then, without ceremony, he raised his baton. The first blow broke the boy's cheekbone, the second split his scalp. Arthur lurched forward, unable to stop himself, but two prisoners grabbed him, holding him back. They whispered fiercely, "You can't save him. If you try, we all die." Thanbyuzayat continued beating the boy until he collapsed. Then he ordered two men to drag the body away. The boy died that night. Arthur sat beside him as the light faded from his eyes. Afterward, Arthur went outside and vomited violently. Rage twisted inside him like barbed wire. But rage was dangerous. Rage got men killed. He forced it down, forced air into his lungs, forced himself to remain still. It was around this period, somewhere between 500 and 550 days, that Arthur's endurance became legend among the prisoners. Men said he didn't sleep, even though he did. They said he could carry double loads, even though every load hurt him. They said he had stared down Thanbyuzayat without flinching, though Arthur remembered trembling internally. One prisoner, a Canadian corporal, whispered to Arthur one night, "You're keeping some of us alive just by being here. If you break, we'll break too." Arthur didn't respond. Being someone else's anchor terrified him more than death. The second year brought the worst phase of the railway construction, the Speedo period. The Japanese demanded rapid progress, forcing prisoners to work 18 hours a day with minimal rest. Men swung pickaxes until their hands bled and the skin peeled from their palms. Arthur's hands grew so infected that his fingers swelled. But he kept working, because he knew stopping invited death. One night, during the Speedo period, Arthur felt his body finally beginning to fail. His vision blurred, his knees buckled, a ringing filled his ears like distant bells. He collapsed against a tree, gasping. A guard spotted him instantly and sprinted toward him. Arthur forced himself up with both hands, staggering, refusing to let his legs fold. The guard hesitated. If he punished a man who was standing, he risked punishment from his own superior. Arthur met the guard's eyes. Something silent passed between them, a recognition of stubbornness the guard could not defeat. The guard spat and walked away. Arthur slid down the tree after the guard left and lay in the mud for several minutes, shaking. Two prisoners dragged him to his feet, whispering that he had to keep moving. He did. Rain returned, turning the world into a swamp. One evening, while building an embankment, Arthur heard a shout from behind him. A log had pinned a prisoner's leg. Arthur didn't hesitate. He dropped his tools and ran. Together with two Australians, he lifted the log enough to free the man's crushed limb. A guard saw the teamwork and charged in, cane raised. The Australians scattered. Arthur remained, shielding the injured man. The cane struck him 8 times. Arthur stayed upright through 6. The 7th buckled him. The 8th drove him to the ground. Before the guard could strike again, an officer called out, and the guard backed off. Arthur lay face down in the mud, barely conscious. But when the shift ended, he rose again. The injured man survived. Arthur considered that a victory. Around the 600th day, Arthur experienced something he had never felt before. A moment of despair so deep it threatened to drown him. He was digging a trench, each shovel of earth feeling like it weighed the world. A sickening thought entered his mind. I don't want to stand up again. It terrified him. He had never allowed the possibility of giving up. He dropped his shovel, breathing hard. Tears burned his eyes, and he wiped them away quickly, ashamed. Just then, a man beside him whispered, "Kellam, if you stop, I'll stop too." The words hit him like a punch. He clenched his jaw, forced himself upright, and resumed digging. That night, lying on the bamboo slats, he whispered to himself, "Not today, not tomorrow." He repeated it like a mantra. As the second year neared its end, guards noticed that Arthur, despite being skeletal, still worked at full pace. Some viewed him with resentment, others with fascination. Once, Sergeant Temita approached him during a meal. Arthur froze, expecting punishment. Instead, Temita placed one additional spoonful of rice in Arthur's bowl. No explanation, no expression, just a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken admission that Arthur had earned something more than contempt. Arthur bowed lightly, not submissively, respectfully. Temita walked away. The second year ended with a rainy season so violent it washed away sections of the railway and entire rows of graves. Arthur worked through it all, fever burning in his blood, body decaying, spirit unbroken. He did not know it yet, but the third year, his final stretch of captivity, would test him in ways the first two had not. Disease would strike again, guards would grow unpredictable, food would become even scarcer, and hope, once a faint glow, would become a dangerous thing to hold. But Arthur Kellam continued because he had no intention of being broken, not by hunger, not by disease, not by cruelty, not by the jungle, not by the men who believed they could crush him. By the end of the second year, around day 730, Arthur stood at the edge of existence, a man made of bone, dirt, scars, and willpower. And he still had over 70 days left. By the time Arthur Kellam entered his third year of captivity, somewhere beyond day 700, his body no longer resembled the soldier who had fought on the Sittang River. His shoulders had sharpened into bony ridges. His arms were little more than sinew stretched over bone. His eyes, once bright and alert, had sunk deep into shadowed hollows. But the same steel that had carried him through the first 2 years still pulsed inside him, defiant and stubborn as ever. The air in the camp felt heavier during those final months, as if the jungle itself knew the war was turning. Rumours trickled through the prisoner ranks, Allied planes sighted, far-off artillery heard, Japanese officers holding urgent meetings behind closed doors. But rumours were dangerous. Hope was dangerous. Men who began to hope often let down their guard, and those who let down their guard died. Arthur guarded himself fiercely. Early in the third year, a new guard arrived, Corporal Ishida. He was younger than most, barely older than Arthur himself, with a face that seemed uncertain whether it belonged to a soldier or a frightened boy. At first, Ishida tried to imitate Temita's severity, barking orders and striking prisoners when they stumbled. But his blows lacked conviction, and prisoners quickly sensed he wasn't cruel, not truly, just afraid to be anything else. One morning, Arthur collapsed while hauling a basket of gravel up a muddy slope. Ishida rushed forward, shouting. Arthur braced for the strike, but Ishida hesitated. His eyes flickered with confusion. Arthur saw it clearly. Ishida had expected to punish laziness. But Arthur looked like a corpse that had refused to lie down. Ishida lowered the cane. "Stand," he ordered quietly, aware Temita was watching from across the clearing. Arthur forced himself upright. Ishida stepped back. Temita's expression didn't change, but something in the officer's posture suggested he had noticed the hesitation. Arthur knew a guard showing mercy was as dangerous as a prisoner showing defiance. That night, Ishida passed by the prisoner's hut and glanced inside. Arthur met his eyes for a split second. It was not friendship, not sympathy, just a moment in which two exhausted human beings recognized something in each other. The war was crushing both sides. But the camp was no place for humanity, and Temita made sure no guard forgot that. A month later, during morning roll call, Temita stopped in front of Arthur. He stared at him for several long seconds. Arthur stared back, not defiantly, but steadily, as if to say, "I'm still here." Temita raised his baton. Arthur didn't flinch. Temita lowered it and moved on. Some prisoners whispered that Temita respected Arthur. Others whispered that he was saving him for a final breaking. Arthur didn't speculate. Speculation was a luxury. Around day 760, cholera returned with a vengeance. Men vomited water as fast as they drank it. Skin sagged, eyes glazed. The death rate soared. The small medical hut overflowed with dying bodies. Arthur spent nights hauling water, cleaning wounds, and holding men's hands as they fought the disease. He didn't think of heroism. He thought of duty, the kind he understood, the duty of one human being to another. One prisoner, an Indian sapper named Rajesh Kumar, clung to life with trembling fingers. Arthur sat beside him for hours, keeping him upright so he could sip water. Rajesh told him stories of his children, of mango trees in his village, of festivals filled with colour. Arthur closed his eyes and tried to imagine colour. It felt like a memory from a life he'd never lived. Rajesh died on the third night. Arthur carried him to the pyre himself. That same week, Arthur developed a fever that burned behind his eyes like fire. He shivered uncontrollably. Every joint felt rusted. He tried to hide it. Fever meant removal from work detail, and removal from work meant death. But on the fifth day, he collapsed while lifting a timber. Tomita saw. The sergeant approached slowly, baton in hand. Prisoners froze, bracing for the inevitable. Tomita knelt beside Arthur, studying him. Arthur forced a whisper. "I can work." His voice cracked. He tried to push himself upright, but his arms trembled violently. Tomita's expression didn't change, but for the first time he didn't strike Arthur. Instead, he barked an order for two men to drag Arthur to the shade. The prisoners exchanged stunned looks. Tomita wasn't showing mercy. Arthur knew that. Tomita was preserving a tool that refused to break. For 2 days, Arthur lay in the hut, delirious. He dreamed of England, of cold mornings, warm bread, the sound of church bells. He dreamed of his mother's voice calling him inside. He dreamed of rivers that weren't filled with corpses. Each time he awoke, he forced himself to drink. Fever had killed men stronger than him. He refused to add his name to the list. By the 4th day, the fever broke. On the 5th, Arthur rejoined the work detail. The guards didn't comment. The prisoners watched in awe. A man who should have died had survived, not through strength, not through medicine, through stubbornness alone. Around day 780, the sounds of distant explosions rolled through the jungle. The prisoners looked up from their tasks, startled. Arthur froze mid-swing, listening. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't monsoon rain. It was artillery. Real artillery. The guards panicked. Officers held hurried meetings. Radios crackled. Some guards shouted. Others grew quiet, as if unsure whether they should obey orders or flee before it was too late. Ishida looked terrified. Tomita looked unreadable. That night, Japanese soldiers began burning documents. Smoke drifted above the camp like a signal. Prisoners whispered frantically. Some thought liberation was imminent. Others feared a massacre, guards killing them before Allied forces arrived. Arthur said nothing. He knew both outcomes were possible. The next morning, the guards ordered the prisoners to assemble. Breathless silence hung over the camp. Tomita stepped forward with his baton behind his back and announced that work was suspended until further instruction. That had never happened. Not once in nearly 800 days. Prisoners exchanged frightened glances. Suspended work could mean many things, and most of them were bad. Later that afternoon, Arthur saw Ishida sitting alone near the perimeter fence, staring at his boots. Something about his posture looked broken. Arthur approached him cautiously. Ishida didn't raise his cane. He didn't shout. He said quietly, in halting English, "War. Changing." Arthur nodded. Ishida didn't look up. "If you live, remember, not all want cruelty." Arthur didn't respond. He didn't know how. Ishida stood abruptly and walked away. On day 795, Arthur felt a tremor of anticipation ripple through the prisoner ranks. Guards were packing. Some were disappearing into the jungle. Others were stripping off insignia. The senior officers held one last meeting, shouting behind closed doors. The next morning, the prisoners awoke to silence. Not the usual silence of exhaustion. Silence like the world had stopped breathing. The guards were gone. Every one of them. Arthur stood in the center of the camp, staring at the empty guard tower. He expected a trick, an ambush, a sudden explosion of violence. But nothing happened. The camp was abandoned, deserted. The gates swung open in the wind. Some prisoners cheered. Some cried. Some fell to their knees, unable to process freedom after so much suffering. Arthur didn't cheer. He walked slowly, almost fearfully, toward the open gate. He placed his hand on the wooden beam. It felt unreal. Too light, too easy. His fingers trembled. He stepped through. Outside, villagers appeared. Thai civilians carrying jars of water, rice, fruits, blankets. Their expressions were tender, shocked, horrified at what they saw. Many prisoners wept openly. Some refused the food, convinced it was a trick. Arthur accepted a cup of water and drank it slowly, each swallow reminding him he was still alive. Later that day, Allied patrols arrived, Australian troops, eyes wide with disbelief at the skeletal figures emerging from the jungle. Medics rushed forward, trying to stabilize men who were barely clinging to life. One medic touched Arthur's arm and gasped, "My God, how long have you been here?" Arthur tried to answer but found his throat too tight to speak. He was carried to a field hospital. As they loaded him into a stretcher, he saw Ishida in the distance, uniform discarded, hands raised, surrendering to Australian soldiers. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Arthur gave the faintest nod. Ishida bowed his head. In the hospital tent, a British chaplain approached Arthur and asked for his name. Arthur whispered it. The chaplain's eyes widened. "Kellam. There were reports you died months ago." Arthur let out a weak breath that almost resembled a laugh. The chaplain leaned close. "Some of the men say you never took an extra grain of rice, that you never stopped working, that you kept others alive when you were dying yourself." Arthur turned his head slowly. "We were all dying," he murmured. "Some just took longer." In the weeks that followed, Arthur's weight rose from nothing to something. His strength returned in trembling increments, but his spirit, unbroken through starvation, disease, and cruelty, remained untouched. Nurses noticed he rarely complained, even when fever returned or ulcers reopened. He simply endured, always endured. When he finally returned to England, stepping off the transport ship at Southampton in early 1946, his mother didn't recognize him at first. Only when he said "Mum" did she collapse into his arms, sobbing. Arthur held her gently, unsure how to explain the years that had forged him into a different man. For the rest of his life, he spoke little of the camps. When people asked how he survived nearly 800 days as a POW, he answered with quiet simplicity, "I refused to break. That was all I had left." But those who served beside him always said the truth was far greater. That Arthur Kellam survived because his will was something the Japanese never understood. Something beyond cruelty, beyond starvation, beyond fear. A stubbornness forged in the mud of Burma, a heart that refused surrender, a spirit that not even 800 days of hell could crush.